I am joined from Belgrade. I was about to say Yugoslavia, because that's how old I am. Serbia by Kit Klarenberg, who is, in my view, I just said this to you offline, but I'm going to say it now publicly. I think you're the best granular analyst of what we call the empire. Some of us call it the American Empire. You call it, and I think correctly, the Anglo-American Empire. You've been writing for many years now, primarily on the Grayzone, but now you have your own platform on Substack called Global Delinquents, which everyone should subscribe to immediately because you're incredibly prolific. Kit, you've written dozens and dozens and dozens of articles on the empire, but always looking underneath. Your special talent is it undercovering the intelligence agencies' workings, especially the British intelligence agencies. So what we're going to do tonight, I just want to say hello to you. Thanks for coming on the show.
My
And
absolute pleasure, and thank you for a ludicrously kind introduction. God bless you.
it's true. It's all true. I mean, people, as soon as they look at, go to everybody watching, go to Global Delinquents. You will see what I mean. Now, Kit, I suppose, I have on my show, I have critics of the empire from the left and the right. And what I'm sort of doing on a bigger scale, I'm hoping politically, is to help build the next anti-imperialist alliance. Um, we had one in the United States, the Anti-Imperialist League, which was founded in 1898 to oppose the Spanish-American War and the global empire generally. And it had like right-wing senators from Alabama who were racists, and it had Eugene Debs and socialists in it, and it had everybody in between, anarchists and Mark Twain, and everybody in it from all kinds of political persuasion stood up against the American empire at its inception, and then it disappeared. The Anti-Imperialist League disappeared in World War One, and we haven't seen it since. But I think we are seeing it actually in a new nascent form. It's amorphous, but I see people on the left and on the right now. I'm just saying this by way of pointing to the fact that I had Daryl Cooper on last week and I have Kit Klarenberg on this week. You guys have different politics, I'm pretty sure, generally, but not on this. On this, I think you guys are pretty much aligned. And so that's what this show is in large part devoted to, is building the next anti-imperialist league. So I think you're probably interested in that. What do you think?
Oh, absolutely. And I think that, I mean, that is a point that crops up over and over again in my work, not by design, but just by sheer urgency of fact that frequently it is the British who have dragged the Americans unwittingly or unwillingly into empire, and that there is a anti-imperialist history of the US that is not told. Well, definitely not in the mainstream, and barely in on the independent scene either. Sadly.
Yeah. So I want to ask you, we meaning people who do this kind of work and are interested in these kinds of things, which unfortunately is probably less than 1% of the population. But anyway, when you say imperialism, what do you mean and why do you not like it?
Well, fundamentally, imperialism is, I mean, in the in its strict kind of different dictionary definition, it's extending power via colonization, via military force or other or other means. I think that it's come to take on in the Anglo-American context, it's come to take on like a very, very, very specific definition, which is a barely, but also quite effectively, actually, veiled white supremacism. And a very specific notion of what whiteness actually constitutes. And there is, as far as I can tell, like the British genuinely who have this kind of sense that they're divinely entrusted and empowered to protect Western civilization from barbarians at the gate like China and Russia. And so, I mean, it's I would say it was was a kind of an empire. If these days it means global domination and like total global domination, and the idea that yes, the entire world is Britain and America's backyard. I mean, that's like that's what I'm talking about when I talk about imperialism. Some people accuse, say like Russia or China of, or you could even say, Turkey is to an extent an imperial power, but because it extends, seeks to extend its power via military force and via the seizure of territory in neighboring countries. But I mean, when you're having a discussion about global imperialism, Turkish imperialism is about, like 1%,
Right.
like compared to the Anglo-American
Right.
strain of it. Let's put it that way.
Right. I love your definition of imperialism, and I think it matches mine, I think, perfectly. But let me flesh it out a little bit, and especially for people watching who identify as conservative or right wing, or from that wing of the anti-imperialist league here. Um, they, I've never talked about this with them. And I think that a lot of them are thinking about this probably maybe for the first time, because as we know, and in a way I was a part of this. I mean, we've spent people on the dissident left and the dissident right, and I think you're included in this, have spent a large part of the last 10 years dismissing all these claims of racism, at least in America and in the UK too, which have been bogus
Mm,
and fraudulent and part of actually global imperialism in certain ways we can talk about. But the Anglo-American Empire, which we can call it. I mean, to me, it was founded in 1760, but we certainly could say 1890, since 1898. That thing,
mm,
um, founded upon, articulated through, enacted upon ideas of race that you can only call racist. Now, I think, and people forget this. We don't talk about it. When Gaza happened, we that's the first time we've talked about race and empire in a long time, sort of
mm,
popularly. Of course, it
mm,
didn't come up in Ukraine, although even in Ukraine, it's in there just in a different way. Anti-Russian racism, but that's a different thing.
mm,
But why don't you talk about that? Because the Brits, in a sense, they invented the racial colonial ideology that animated their empire building, especially in the 19th century, and which the Americans just followed on and refined in certain ways. And it wasn't quite as nakedly racist in certain ways, but it also
mm,
was. So, but yeah, can you riff on that? I mean, because I think people watching this who are anti-empire, or at least critics of the
mm.
empire, many of them won't know this history and are not aware that it's truly built. And again, I'm have shown myself to be one of the biggest skeptics of claims of racism there is. So let's talk about that.
Right, sure. Well, I mean, I think it's important. In this context, like, there is you might want to add this in post production, but there's this amazing picture from the time of the Boxer Rebellion, where it was arranged by the. This is when an eight-nation alliance led by Britain invaded China in the late 1800s. And yeah, there is a photo celebrating this alliance in which the eight participating nations, their soldiers are ranked according to British understanding of race. So first there
Mm,
was the British, then there was an American, then there was an Australian, then there was a British Indian, then there was a German, then there was a Frenchman, an Austro-Hungarian, an Italian, and then finally a Japanese soldier. Like they were ranked, they were meant to be ranked in order of, yes, racial hierarchy. Interestingly, the Brit was shorter than the American, so they gave him a big hat to make him look taller, to like reinforce this bullshit notion of Anglo supremacy. But yeah, like that view of the world is very, very ingrained. I mean, absolutely in British elite thinking, but I mean, it does to an extent, end up trickling down throughout, the rest of society. This notion that, like, that we're different, and we're special, and most crucially of all, we're better. Now, I mean, you mentioned, the anti-imperialist movement which grew during the Spanish Civil War. One of my favorite American writers is Henry James, who, during this period, wrote a number of excoriating essays on the idea of creating an American empire and how it would be a betrayal of the American Revolution. And there are my two favorite quotes from his writings are, "How can we, who honestly cannot govern ourselves at home, take up the task of governing others?" Right. So that's question one. And yes, point two. While acquiring an empire might have civilized the English, it will make barbarians of us. Right, like,
Yep.
it's. I think that strikes me as like in a very American,
Mm.
perspective. It's just like, well, we're the new world. There's no need for us to be involved in the old world, and there's no need for us to have an empire because we're so impossibly vast and wealthy as it is.
Yeah.
And it was like it was. I mean, funnily enough, the reason that the Germans wanted an empire so much, and kicked off a chain of events that led to World War One, was familial jealousy. Was because Kaiser Wilhelm was effectively a member of the British, which is to say German royal family, and he was jealous of the fact that the rest of his family members all had empires, because all the kings and queens of Europe were British.
Hmm.
And so, like, I think that in it just I think basically that the a short version of what has happened in the world since 1945, and we will go into much greater detail about this, is that prior to World War II, in a history that nobody knows, and I've written about for my website, in the late 1930s, the British Empire was basically coming apart at the seams. It had gotten so big that they couldn't afford to run it anymore. It had basically become a drain on resources. Most of their wealth was tied up in India. Most of the rest of the empire wasn't actually making a profit, or resulting in any tangible benefits for people at home. Does this remind you of anything in modern America now?
Hmm.
And they decided to effectively look for help to reinvigorate their flagging economic fortunes, and also maintain their empire. And they thought of Nazi Germany as their world partner. And they engaged in a
Right.
long-running effort, like, to forge a global empire with Nazi Germany. And then when that didn't work out, and they blunderingly, like, entered into a war that they didn't want to fight and thought that they would lose, and in the end they did. They decided to outsource the work of running their empire to the US. Quite literally, and the last, say, yes, 80 years, like nearly a century, have basically consisted of the British trying to, on one hand, maintain their own fantasies of being a major global power of, military, cultural, economic significance, but also, yes, as well, maintain US hegemony, or further US hegemony, and yeah, steer the US in ways that befit their interests. And it's not they're not always successful, and I'm certainly not someone who takes the kind of LaRoucheite view that, like, Britain controls
Yeah.
America. But if you think about, like, so many of the issues around the world that the US is overwhelmingly preoccupied with, trying to resolve, like, I mean, Israel Palestine. This all goes back to
Yeah.
the British.
Right.
You could make the argument
Hmm.
that the invasion of Russia, but led by Britain and France in 1917, in response to the Russian Revolution, led us to where we are now. In many ways,
Hmm. Hmm.
and like a tremendous Russian fear of the West, and this yeah and this and yes and an enduring British obsession with carving up Russia into
Yeah.
manageable chunks for the ease of exploitation of its vast
Yeah.
resources. And it's like there are so many historical through lines, and
Yeah.
very
Huh.
like that's not to say that Britain isn't a servile lapdog that will say how high whenever it's asked to jump.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it does mean that they have a degree of influence that is not really talked about or understood. And actually, I've caught a lot of flack since the start of the Ukraine proxy war because people say Britain is a puppet of the Americans. Like what how can you possibly suggest that British intelligence is doing things like blowing up Kerch Bridge without the US knowing about it? And then like we're getting to the point now, through nearly 3.5 years into this thing, where the mainstream media is finally admitting the British role as the quote unquote brains of the proxy war. Like I mean, it is literally an example of Britain using US wealth and muscle for its own project,
Hmm.
which they are willing to try and intensify, escalate in the hope that they drag the US further in. And I have reported on leaked emails between senior British military and intelligence officials, but they literally say this. They say the Biden's hesitancy. I mean, his hesitancy being doing everything he said he wouldn't do, which he said would result in World War III,
Hmm.
like giving Ukraine fighter jets and allowing them to
Right.
strike inside Russia. But for the British, that's not enough. And you've got to bet. I think that they probably had exactly the same feeling in Syria. There are so many examples of the British wanting to go further than the Americans and trying to use American military might to do so. In this instance, they're using American weapons. It's not, for the most part, Americans dying in Donbass, but that has been a long-standing objective. And as I say, they're not always successful at it. And I think that actually the distrust of the British is historically a very American thing. And you've got to bear in mind that, like, so the Suez Crisis, which formally ended Britain's empire in 1956, that was as it was created by Britain and France staging using a false flag incident with Israel in the Suez Canal in order to try and take out nationalist leader Nasser in Egypt, and the US ordered them to turn back and said,
That's right.
we're going to open fire on you and we'll
Hmm.
crash your currency if you
Hmm.
don't turn back right now.
Yep.
And Eisenhower was considered quite pally with the British because of their experience of World War II. Like, and where where Eisenhower was based in London, throughout the conflict, and effect was effectively in charge of Britain's military, and was like even he was willing to say no to the British, much to their detriment and without any consideration for the consequences. It's actually much newer for this sense of Britain and America being so close. That's something that has emerged within my lifetime, I would say, and I'm not even 40.
Yeah.
Shocking as it may be to believe, but and I think that it just I got into reporting on this not out of choice because one day I was like, oh, I'm really interested in mapping how Britain influences the US. I was led down this path quite organically, just by doing the granular research that you mentioned into how the modern empire functions, and again and again and again. from World War from yes from basically from World War II until today. If there's some problem happening in the world, it was caused by the British. It has been instigated in real time by the British. It's two or a maximum 3 degrees of separation each and every time.
Yeah.
And I think that yes, you got to bear in mind that yeah, the basis of the Cold War, and this is again an untold, unknown it's history, is that at the end of World War II, FDR, who, yes, in historic keeping with US presidents, didn't trust the British, was increasingly sidelining Churchill from discussions about the shape of the post-war world. Because Britain's empire was finished, he thought that they were completely like over as
Correct.
a power, and he envisaged a world that would be governed by spheres of influence between the US and the Soviet Union. And Churchill was extremely upset about this, and was willing to try and do anything to sabotage call it a détente or whatever you like between the US and Russia, which many writers have historically predicted. I might add, like Alex de Tocqueville predicted this would happen, like centuries ago. Like in the 1800s, he envisaged a future Earth that is dominated by Russia and America. But anyway, the
Wow.
point is that he was willing to do anything to try and sabotage peace between the Soviet Union and the US. And in 1947, right when Britain is fighting a number of anti-imperialist uprisings across not only their own empire but other empires. Like they're involved in Vietnam. They're fighting to
Hmm.
install a government in Greece,
Hmm.
and they're trying to put down anti-imperialist rebellions like in Africa, in Asia, in Cyprus.
Yeah.
And they are, this is while they're completely screwed. They're basically bankrupt. Churchill goes to Fulton, Missouri, in 1947, and he gives this
Right.
famous speech. This is March, I believe it was March 1947, that
Right.
he gave this, no, sorry, 1946, sorry, in which he gave this speech, which it's now referred to as the Iron Curtain speech, where he mints all these phrases about oh, there needs to be a global special relationship between the British Commonwealth and the US. And yeah, he talks about an Iron Curtain descending across Europe and the threat of Soviet encroachment, and
Yeah.
the dangers of a new war with the Soviet Union, which Churchill
Mhm.
wanted at the end of World War II.
Yep. Yep.
And was pushing for.
Yep. Yep.
The response to Churchill's speech at the time in the US was one of public outcry. Like there were protests of people saying, "Don't listen to imperialist Winnie," and like newspaper editorials saying, "Who the hell is this Brit coming to our country to tell us who our enemies are?" Like like it was discussed actually.
Wow.
But this was basically what helped start the Cold War, because
Yeah.
by this point you have Harry Truman, who to put it mildly, was not the sharpest knife in the drawer and had no experience of foreign affairs, surrounded by British advisors, and had people like Churchill begging him to get involved in the empire game. It was a decision he came to regret, as did Eisenhower, as did, well, Kennedy, but we see what happened there. Interesting alternative histories arise from so much of this. But I think that yeah, that if you think about the British stirring up the Cold War, as like in a modern epoch, like think about Russiagate.
Yeah. Right.
The British operatives were at the forefront of pushing this,
Everywhere.
and I think in terms of you talked about doing a kind of tour de force deep dive into my reporting. I think the thing that really kind of put like the reporting that really I think had my biggest impact after I became a journalist. It was at the end of 2018 I started reporting on the activities of something called Integrity Initiative, which was this British government funded black propaganda unit that put out anti-Russian propaganda. Like all of the stories of Russian meddling in the West originated in this unit. And I visited their offices and managed to get in, and then got thrown out by
Damn.
someone who just so happened to work on Bernie Sanders'
Oh,
campaign.
no way.
Yeah, yeah, no, it was what I was completely wild. Bear in mind that this is like a front company run by MI6. I like what I just I managed to get into their offices, and I was met by this guy called Simon, and he was like, oh, how can I help? And I was like, right, well, I'm a journalist, and I've got a few questions for you, because a few weeks earlier, documents exposing their internal workings had leaked online from
Right.
Anonymous, and I've been reading them. And like immediately, the second I said I was a journalist to this Simon dude, he like went white as a sheet and had like wide staring eyes and was just like, get out, like invading my personal space. And I thought that I'd kind of messed up the story because I'd like managed to get in, but then just immediately been shown the door. And I'm like sat by the Thames, near where their office was, and I'm like just trying to find out who's called Simon at Integrity Initiative. Oh, it's this guy Simon Bracey Lane who had no interest in politics, but then suddenly volunteered to work for Bernie Sanders because
Oh,
just by accident,
oh my
like just
God.
yeah, accidental tourist, like really not suspicious at all.
And
And so I really started digging into this organization, and we fast forward to today, and the people who are running it are now overseeing Britain's management of the Ukraine proxy war. The very same people.
so wait, they did Russiagate originally?
Mm, mm. Yeah, they were responsible for pushing Russiagate.